I'm Laura Blumenthal on the Berkshire Heroes podcast, and joining me today is Nicole Bryan, who is a certified birth and postnatal doula who helps families across Berkshire. Welcome, Nicole.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you here. Now, I know you've got your own practice called Your Birth Story, but start by telling me, what is a doula? How is it different from a midwife? And what motivated you to start up your own practice?
Yeah, so what is a doula? So we are a non-clinical based support professional birth partner for women and birthing people. So we support with all of the non-clinical tasks. So a midwife, for example, will be taking blood pressure and taking bloods and, really understanding that more medical clinical side of birth. Whereas a doula, we support much more holistically, all of the emotional, spiritual, informational, which is a big part of my job. And it's supporting the whole family as well. It's not just supporting the person who's in labour and birth, it's supporting the whole support network as well and bringing everything in to really help women feel more empowered, more informed, more calm. We use a whole bunch of different comfort measures. So most of us will use a variation of massage, visualizations, various other non-pharmaceutical pain relief techniques. I personally trained in hypnobirthing, rebozo, and biomechanics, so I tend to use a lot of stuff around positioning and using a scarf to help release physical tension, and hypnobirthing for a lot of the emotional tension and fears around birth as well. And then you said, how did I start the practice? So my journey started when I had my first baby back in 2019. So I think, like most people, their first pregnancy, I was filled with such fear. And, that how is this getting out of there kind of fear and not really understanding what's going on. And my husband, I think, had very different fears. I think he was very much like, I don't know how to support, this is really your domain. I'm just there as a bystander, because that's mostly what you see on TV. So neither one of us really knew what we were doing. And we did the standard antenatal course that most people go ahead and do. But to be honest, I think for both of us, we came away feeling a bit lost still. Neither one of us felt ready. We just felt like we had information, but didn't really know what to do with that information. And then by chance, I joined a yoga and hypnobirthing class. And I'll be honest, I almost didn't go, because if you knew me 6 years ago, the thought of me doing something like this is so out of this world. And even just the word hypnobirthing, I thought, that's not my tribe, that's not me. But I went along. And whilst it didn't go into the kind of intense detail that I now go into, it just planted a seed. It planted this seed that birth didn't have to be what we see on TV, and it didn't have to be what my friends and family had experienced. That actually it could be really positively transformational. And I think just that glimmer of hope made me think, well, what have I got to lose? It's worth a try. So I then, on my own, dived really deep into hypnobirthing. I read tons of studies. My husband's an actual scientist, so very much a left brain thinker. So I showed him all the studies and evidence as well, and he was really on board. And then during my first birth with my son, Kai, which is literally just 6 years ago now, it was such an empowering experience. It was so positive. Not everything went to plan. It wasn't about things going to a plan or, a particular schedule. But the entire way through, I felt really supported by my husband. He knew exactly the right questions to ask, how to support me, when to support me. I felt totally autonomous the whole way through my birth. And I remember, almost immediately, the moment I was born, he was still on my chest in the pool and me pointing to my husband saying, I need to teach other women this. It just felt like this enormous injustice that I'd had the experience I had, yet so many people were not having that. So that's when I launched Your Birth Story. And I started off just teaching group and private hypnobirthing and antenatal classes, which I loved and still do love. But I started to notice a bit of a pattern that whilst the birth stories were coming back, they were really positive, women did feel really empowered. There were just little bits of the story that made me go, okay, I'm not really setting these women up or the birth partners with the advocacy tools that they need. So they're going into the system feeling really confident in their body and confident in their baby, but then they're hit with a system that doesn't necessarily align with that. And I was finding that a lot of births were just getting derailed, and often for reasons that were just not evidence-based. And that was really frustrating. So it was from that then I just wanted to go a little bit deeper and started to support women as a doula. So now I support throughout labour, so antenatally, and then throughout labour, birth, and postpartum. And it just really means that I'm able to walk alongside them through that whole journey and really support when women are facing that fear-based messaging or coercive language or care plans that don't reflect evidence or their personal wishes. I'm able to walk alongside them through that, which I love. It's an incredibly privileged position to be in. I'm very, very lucky.
And I was on your website, I watched some of the testimonials from the people that you've helped, and there are people from all walks of life, and they're very much like, oh, I thought a doula would be a bit woo woo, but it's not at all. My husband was really skeptical, but it really helps. It made me feel so much more supported, so much more reassured. And I suppose, what is the process that you go through when you support parents to be? What is hypnobirthing? I've no idea what that is, and what is your process?
Yeah, so hypnobirthing, first of all, so it's a birth preparation technique that focuses primarily on the mind. So it works with understanding the mind-body connection, and this is something this is in all of our life, not just in birth. But the way that we think and feel about things has an impact on our physiology. So the way I often describe it that people can relate to when they're like, mind-body connection, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, is I talk about when you're watching a scary movie, what happens to your heart rate? It tends to increase. What happens to your palms? You tend to become sweaty. You feel tense in your muscles. Those are all a physiological response to something that you're observing in your brain, in your mind. You're watching a scary movie, but you're not actually in any danger. You're watching something on TV. There's no real threat, but your body has a physiological response to it that you can't control. So with hypnobirthing, we're unpacking that, getting an understanding of that and how that impacts birth, and then really stripping it away, understanding what fears people have of birth, how we can, how our nervous system is impacted from our environment, from words that are used, from smells we might smell, and then taking control of those things. So one of the processes that I use in hypnobirthing a lot is called anchoring. And we look at all five senses, and we look at things that you smell that make you feel relaxed. So you might already have a smell that reminds you of something. If you don't, I typically recommend lavender. There might be some music that makes you feel really relaxed, maybe a playlist from your wedding or playlist from a holiday. And we go through all of the five senses, and then we start to incorporate those into your birth space, whether you're birthing at home or you're planning an elective cesarean. It doesn't really matter. Hypnobirthing is for all births. I cannot stress that enough. I think that's one of the misconceptions about hypnobirthing, is that it's just for candlelit home births. But I would argue really strongly that it's also for unplanned and elective cesareans as well. But with anchoring, we would put all of those different things together that engage our parasympathetic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that makes us feel rested, it makes us feel calm, everything's within our body working as it should do. And we incorporate that into our birth preparation, so that then when birth comes, we can bring out those triggers, those anchors, to put ourselves into a state of relaxation. We also use breathing techniques, visualizations, all the techniques that are going to work along with our nervous system to make us feel more relaxed, because when we're more relaxed, our body functions as it should, because we're not holding on to tension, physical tension or emotional tension and fear. So that's how I would describe hypnobirthing. It's really more understanding birth from a neurological point of view and a hormonal point of view. And the process of working with a doula. So a lot of people tend to choose a doula, but for all different reasons people choose a doula. For me personally, what I've noticed lately is that women are contacting me a little bit later in their pregnancy journey, women that have had really straightforward pregnancies, but then they've been thrown a curveball at the last minute. Maybe they've been told that they've got gestational diabetes, something that the evidence doesn't support, to have an induction, but they're now being pressured. So I'm certainly noticing that women are coming to me a little bit later to say, everything was going fine, but now I'm being fear-mongered into these decisions. I feel I'm being coerced. And then a doula would come along to support that journey. We're never there to give people empowerment or give people power. It's about reminding families the power that they already have and the rights that they already have. So then, the process we work throughout pregnancy, education, with advocacy, with building confidence for everyone within that unit, not just the woman who's birthing. And then we support throughout the whole of labour. So doulas usually arrive before the midwife, because we're supporting more with the emotional side of birth. We stay for birth, and then we usually stay until at least the first feed of the baby, whether that be breastfeeding or bottle feeding. And then most doulas will usually do a postnatal visit for birth reflections, which is the most incredible thing to do because hospitals don't offer this as standard. And there are so many studies that show that having that opportunity to reflect on what's happened and piece all the part of the puzzle together can really support with a reduction of postnatal depression. So that part of the job I particularly feel passionate about. But yeah, that's kind of the process of working with a doula, how we sort of walk alongside the whole way through. We're not in front, we're not leading, we don't make any decisions at all. We're just there to support whatever decisions the person who's actually birthing a baby wants to make.
I was on the All Party Parliamentary Group for Birth Trauma's website, and last year they brought out a report. They interviewed mothers and maternity staff, and they found, quote, the picture to emerge was of a maternity system where poor care is all too frequently tolerated as normal and women are treated as an inconvenience. And then it goes on to talk about understaffing the NHS and how women's birth wishes are often just ignored. And I found this truly shocking. This is not where we want to be with maternity services in this country at all. And I wondered if that might be driving expectant parents to seek support from yourself, to feel safer, to feel more confident. I wondered what your experiences have been and what you've heard from mothers who have given birth locally.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely driving the need for doulas. That report, I think, was shocking. Oh, well, shocking, but not surprising. And sadly, being a birth worker, that's what we encounter and we see regularly. Stories of women being ignored, being rushed, being misinformed, being coerced into making decisions. And I think one of the worst things to come out of the report, which again, lots of us know this already, but it's great to see it in the report because it makes it more mainstream, is just this understanding that it's often the woman that's being blamed. It's your body, it's your age, it's your BMI, your pelvis, your baby's size, your ethnicity. It's always that blame is put onto the individual, but it's more often not the case. It's more often that it's the system that's the problem, and making it very, very difficult for women to birth in the way that they want. And I think that growing awareness is empowering people. I think many people are now turning to doulas to fill that gap, fill the gap of continuity of care, which is a model proven to improve outcomes. And I think doulas are really able to support women and birthing people find their voices, because we're not just offering comfort and information, but also the confidence to ask the right questions for them. I think what I hear from local families is, like I said, I often work with women that already have low risk, healthy pregnancies, and then suddenly they're labelled with something that's high risk, and then their whole care plan changes. I think what's really challenging is them knowing that they have a right, and them understanding that they can ask questions. And the one big thing that I really talk about a lot to all of my clients is understanding that a guideline is just a suggestion. The way that guidelines are put across in hospitals is very much, this is what we need to do. This is, it's not really put like a recommendation. So the analogy, I love an analogy, and the analogy I usually use is that it's like when you go into a restaurant and that chef for that day, the crab is the special. So you're presented with the crab, it's the special of the day, whether that's because it's freshly caught or because they've got an abundance, or it's going off and it needs to go today. Whatever the reason, it doesn't matter, but that's the chef's special for the day. You never ever feel pressured to have it. You look at it, you weigh up the pros and the cons, you think about what you fancy, and then you order accordingly, whether you want the chef special or whether you want the steak or the veggie dish. It doesn't matter. You never ever feel pressured. But in a hospital setting, in the maternity system, the guidelines are put across like the chef would come out and say, I really strongly recommend that you have the crab. If you don't have the crab, I can't guarantee that you won't get food poisoning. And that's often how it feels with guidelines in the maternity system. It's like, well, I can't guarantee that X, Y, or Z won't happen. And it really feels very coercive. It feels very pressured. And women aren't necessarily, they're not given the information. They're not given the alternatives. It's, even as a doula, when I'm sat there now, I would generally say that if you have a doula sat next to you, you're more likely to get more information anyway, because the care provider is going to see that you've got somebody there that's got your back. They're going to advocate for you, and they're going to encourage you to ask more questions. So typically you get more information anyway. But even with me sat there, I've witnessed women really try to fight and get information about, but how does this relate to me, and what are the alternatives for me? And that's really hard. That's really hard information for a lot of women to get, and it can feel confrontational, and it shouldn't. It should be like going to a restaurant and saying, we recommend the crab, but actually there's all these other things in the restaurant as well that you can choose from. What do you fancy? What works best for you? That's how it should be, but that's not how it feels. I think that's one big thing that I see a lot, and I think that pressure is making a lot of families look towards doulas to give them that extra bit of support. Again, we're not talking for them, but we're just able to signpost them to the right information that's evidence-based and relevant for them, so they can help themselves make a more informed decision.
And why do you think the women are being pressured? Is it because the healthcare professionals are being encouraged to direct them in a particular way? Is it because they're being encouraged to do things which are cheaper? Where is this pressure coming from?
So I think it's multifaceted. I think there's lots of different areas that pressure is coming from. I think one of the sad things that it's coming from is fear of litigation, because in healthcare, you're going to be judged on what you didn't do, not what you did do. And if you've done too much too soon, you're far less likely to face litigation than if you didn't do something. So at the end of the day, when somebody is, oh well, we did the induction, we did the forceps, or we moved forward to a cesarean, so everyone's safe, everyone's alive. That's a really low bar. But actually, from a litigation point of view, we did everything that we possibly could. Had they not done those things, one might argue that maybe the outcome wouldn't have been so bad. So I think fear of litigation is definitely one of driving forces. I have an enormous amount of empathy for midwives and obstetricians. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a divide between doulas and the more clinical caregivers, but we're all there for one reason. And I don't believe for one second that there would be a midwife anywhere across the globe that isn't there because they love to help and they're passionate about what they do. But we are also working alongside midwives and obstetricians that have faced a lot of their own trauma. And if they've had a bad experience personally, they're far more likely to err on the side of extra caution the next time round. And, I thought about this myself, that my son really injured himself a few years ago running upstairs in our bedroom. And so now every time he runs upstairs, I'm like, no, stop, because I can see it. I can see it playing out in my head, him having this injury again, this accident. It's never going to happen again, but it changes the way that I respond to him and how risk adverse I am. And I think when I put that into context of midwives, if they've had an example where somebody with gestational diabetes wasn't induced, and then maybe that outcome wasn't as good, it's making that connection. Oh God, it's because we didn't induce them, and maybe they faced personal litigation, or maybe they faced issues at work because of that. So I think that's one of the things. I think there are lots and lots of reasons, but yeah, those are the two main ones I can think of.
Nicole, the women who want more interventions and might be thinking they're going to be dissuaded from it, are they getting the interventions that they want? Are you seeing that happening?
Yes, absolutely. And, as a doula, again, a misconception would be that we're anti-intervention, which isn't the case at all. But what we do advocate for is for those interventions being based on informed choice and based on relevant evidence for them. So one worrying trend that we've been seeing for years now is the rise of intervention. So inductions are up to over 30% now. Cesarean sections are closing into 50% of births. But we're not seeing any real difference in the stillbirth rate. And I think there's this sense that, intervention being pushed upon women, whether that being in the moment or just societal, that, we need intervention to keep babies safe. I think there's this whole narrative around that. But actually, when we take a step back and we see, well, intervention rate is rising, but stillbirth rate is plateauing, there's been an ever so slight decrease in recent years, but that's all certainly not in line with how quickly induction and cesareans are increasing. And I think it's important that families understand that and also understand that intervention does in itself also have risks. I think sometimes intervention is pushed upon women because they're trying to avoid a certain outcome. But the risk of that intervention often isn't also explained. It would be, well, we recommend induction because of X, Y, and Z, and this is going to help your baby. But they're not told about the risks of that. And as we saw with the birth trauma reports, that actually with more intervention, women are having worse experiences as well, and they're taking away a lot more trauma from their birth. So yes, when women want those interventions, it's being supported. But my fear is that women are choosing to have intervention not through informed decision making, but through fear and coercion.
And do you have any memorable moments where you think, I really helped those parents, I made a real difference here, and this is why I do it?
Yeah, I think there's been so many amazing families that I've worked with. I think, often we say as doulas that the less we do, the better, because women know how to birth. They don't need us to do anything. But I'd say there was one example where it did do something, and it really did feel like it had a very positive impact. And it was a woman who, she was in her 40s, she conceived via IVF, so she'd already ticked a few high risk boxes. So I'd really worked alongside her for her to advocate to have a home birth, which isn't easy once you've got a high risk label, but really supported and walked alongside her to do that. Again, I didn't do anything. She did all of that, but I think just having somebody by her side to hold that space for her. And then during labour was actually quite prolonged. There were 2 nights of really quite intense labour that if she were in hospital, I would put money on the fact that that would have escalated into further intervention. But we was able to support her to stay at home. By the morning after the second quite intense night, I spent some time with her, and we did 2 types of release. I did one emotional release using hypnobirthing technique. So that really looked like kind of giving her a foot massage to begin with, going through a guided fear release visualization. And then after that, she had a big old cry, so like a really big emotional release. And then I followed that using some rebozo, a traditional Mexican scarf technique, to release some of the fascia and the kind of physical tension that she was holding around her pelvis.
What does that mean, Nicole?
So it's a scarf, it's called a rebozo, and they're made in Mexico. And this particular technique is called shaking the apples, which you drape the scarf over the bum and hips, pull it taut, and then just shake. And just kind of shake it gently, and it releases all the fascia. So the fascia, when you peel open an orange, and the segments of the orange have that kind of white, very faint kind of veiny stuff through it. That's fascia. So all of our muscles have that. And it's that fascia that can kind of hold onto tension. So by shaking the apples, it just helps release all of that around the pelvis. So she'd had this big emotional release, then a physical release to relax her pelvic floor. And then labour, once we'd done all of that, within a couple of hours, labour, it just went. And once it was going, it actually was really quick. I think body and baby were ready, but she was holding on emotionally and physically. She'd had quite a traumatic birth experience the first time round. So I think she was holding on quite a bit. And it was just the most incredible birth. I cannot describe it. And that birth, that early emotional and physical release, I felt like actually I'd really supported her in that. But the birth was actually really healing for me as well, because after the baby was born, the baby wasn't breathing immediately. But the midwives were just incredible. They stayed really calm. They kept the cord intact because they knew that the cord was still giving the baby all of the oxygen and blood that it needed. And just very, very calmly, we all just waited. And then after a minute or so, the baby took its first breath, and then baby went immediately on skin to skin. And I found that really healing, because in my home birth, my baby also wasn't breathing, and the cord was cut immediately, which is kind of standard practice, even though the evidence doesn't support it. The evidence supports keeping the cord intact if any resuscitation needs to happen. But standard practice is to cut immediately and take the baby away to resus. And I reflect on that really sadly, that I didn't have a choice in it. If I knew then what I know now, I would have had in my birth plan that if the baby needs resuscitating, to keep the cord intact rather than cutting it immediately. So it's little things like that I think a doula can really support with, because we understand the evidence versus standard practice are sometimes not aligned with one another. And that's a perfect example, because the evidence would say keep the cord intact, but practice would be to cut the cord immediately, because I'm sure practically it's easier to cut the cord and take the baby away to resus. But long term, the long term impacts of that, both mum and baby, could be much worse than the short term of actually just keeping baby attached to the cord and it's getting its oxygen. So yes, that's one birth that really sticks out, where I feel like I made a big difference, and actually the birth made a big difference to me as well personally. And I think other ones, I mean, birth reflections, I think are always impactful. And there was one birth, it was first time parents. The birth didn't go how they had hoped, how they had planned. After an intervention, birth ramped up really quickly and became intense very quickly. And when they were first reflecting on the birth, both mum and dad were feeling quite disappointed and like they didn't cope very well. But during the birth reflections, which typically the way I do it is that mum goes first, then dad, and then me, because we all have our own version of that birth. We all have our own experience of it, and it helps fill in all of the gaps. And by the end of the reflection session, both mum and dad came away feeling really positive and really empowered and like, gosh, yeah, I'd forgotten about that bit. That was amazing. God, did I do that? You know, and it felt really nice to be able to gift them the memory of that birth as being really empowering and positive and take away that sense of disappointment. That felt really lovely coming away from that.
And what would be your number one piece of advice for mums and dads to be?
Trust your intuition, trust your gut over anything else, and know that you have the right to ask questions. It's, you know, how does that apply to me? Can I have more information? Can you share the evidence with me? What are the alternatives? You know, understanding that guidelines, if people could just see guidelines like the chef's special, I think that will reframe how people walk into the hospital. And when they're receiving guidelines and recommendations, I just wish they could think about a crab special and go, yeah, quite fancy that, or no, I'm good, thanks. Let's see what else is on the menu. So yeah, instincts and understanding that guidelines are just the chef's special.
And what are you focusing on right now, and how can people find you online?
Yeah, so right now I've got quite a lot of births coming up, which is really exciting. I have 2 more courses this year, group hypnobirthing and antenatal classes. The big project I'm working on at the moment is building a hut in my garden for a dedicated birth pregnancy space. People won't be labouring there, but it's where I hope to hold all of my future classes and workshops and lots of other workshops in the pipeline. I really want to focus more on advocacy training. So, you know, kind of a dedicated space where we just give everyone within the birth team the tools that they're going to need in advocacy. And I'm really excited for that, because sometimes what people learn in a class or read from a book then doesn't match up to what they're faced with in the hospital. So really giving them the tools to navigate the system is a big thing I'm working on. And to find me, so I'm on Instagram. I'm not much of an influencer, I'll be honest, but my Instagram handle is Your Birth Story by Nicole. And my website is, it's a pretty long-winded website, but it's your-birth-story.com.
And if you were Prime Minister, what would you change about the UK and why?
Yes, I thought about this. I think there's so much on the maternity system that would be incredible to overhaul. But I think actually the most compelling thing for me would be to go way back to education at schooling age. I think if at childhood age, if we were taught about the physiology of birth, or let's not even think about birth, we were just taught about our physiology, and we were taught about our nervous system and how our mind and body are connected, I think actually it would have an enormous impact on the way that we approached health and the way that we approach healthcare. I think if people had a better understanding of actually what our bodies and our nervous system and our minds need and how they are all connected so deeply, then I think not only would we be raising a whole generation of people that would understand birth better, but also general health better. My sister-in-law is a PT, and we talk, it's amazing how similar what she does as a PT is to what I do as a doula, because actually so much of it is about just understanding of our body and our mind. So I think if we could teach that more from childhood at school, I think that would have long-standing impacts across the board.
Your job sounds like an absolute emotional roller coaster, Nicole, but thank you so much for joining me on the Berkshire Heroes podcast, and keep doing what you're doing and supporting those parents to be, because it's such important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Laura.